As Capcom continued remaking the older Resident Evils, a question came to everyone's mind. Are they really going to do it? Are they really going to try to make it better? Is it even possible? These were all widespread concerns when people were speculating about whether Capcom would take a shot at the revered fourth entry in the series. Granted, if they had been hit in the head so hard they forgot about the stiff controls from the original and had their rose-tinted glasses flung off, they'd have realized that they had nothing to worry about with a remake. While the original Resi 4 was groundbreaking at the time, it hasn't aged well, especially if you didn't play it at the time because you were 4 years old like I was and still trying to wrap your head around Galaga. Something that was worth preserving, though, was the shift from survival to shooter that left a major imprint on not only subsequent Resident Evil games, but the industry as a whole. So off the backbone of some successful and some remakes of the previous games, Capcom took another crack at 4 and ended up adding one of the best changes to a remake ever. Among changes to update things like the graphics and pacing of the game's structure, the developers also look to improve on the combat. The challenge here is to not disturb the key tenets of the classic combat from the original while adding something new. While this is a bit of a restriction in that the enemies, their behavior, and Leon's arsenal couldn't be massively changed, many smart mechanics have been created under heavy constraints. And since pressure makes diamonds, Capcom decided the best way to innovate would be to look at other combat-focused games. Resident Evil 4 really isn't a melee-focused game unless you're doing a challenge run. In fact, you're going to want to stay out of melee as much as possible, since that's where most enemies deal the most damage and Leon deals the least. The primary ways to get out of melee in the original that's preserved in the sequel are break-free sequences and stagger attacks. The break-frees occur when Leon gets grabbed in melee and the player has a chance to react in a quick-time sequence before he takes damage. If successful, the enemy is knocked back or killed if they have low enough health. Stagger knockdowns are triggered by hitting enemies in certain body parts until they stagger for a moment. Once this happens, the player can run into melee to get off a free attack that knocks down the staggered enemy. Both of these attacks give the player a chance to get back to a safe range and more time to get off more shots. They are, however, distinct in a couple important ways. First, break-frees are entirely reactive, meaning the player can only utilize them after an appropriate enemy attack, while staggers and the subsequent knockdowns are active attacks, which give the player a reward for risking getting into melee combat. This risk usually leads to these two types of attacks chaining together and creating some intense sequences. The second major difference between the two is that one is started in melee and one is primarily started at range, leaving us with a reactive melee attack and an active attack that begins at range. And if we look at our handy-dandy attack chart, that means we have a big hole in the middle that's begging to get filled. So, the parry is a move that Leon can pull off when an enemy is about to land an attack on him, and the player times a click or press at a reasonable enough time before the attack connects. This either has the effect of directly staggering an enemy, like the ranged stagger attacks, or makes them follow through the attack and allows them to recover faster than them for a quick hit. A successful parry, as you would expect, also protects Leon from all damage from the parried attack. And the parry can also be used just as effectively at range, allowing the player to deflect all kinds of projectiles. If we take a look back at our handy-dandy attack chart, we see that the parry operates in the area between break-frees and stagger attacks. This allows the parry to be an effective and useful move for the player because it fits into their arsenal with distinct use cases. In this way, the remake's combat begins to flow like a well-tuned fighting game, where each jump, block, dodge, or grab has a best-case scenario to be used. The skill of a player is largely determined by how well they can think and act in the moment to bring the right tool for the job on a second-by-second basis. Avoiding overlap between mechanics and providing defined uses for each move or weapon in this way can make combat feel effortless and smooth in games where it's done well, and sluggish and monotonous when it's not. Luckily for Resident Evil fans, Capcom was able to see where there were gaps in the original's design that could be added to and improved upon without dramatically changing the overall product. While the parry itself may not be a game-selling feature or one that makes the remake definitively better than the original in the eyes of some players, it is able to support the core gameplay loop while not detracting from it if players choose to avoid it. This can be seen as raising the skill ceiling without raising the skill floor, allowing fresh or experienced players to have great experiences without feeling like things are too difficult or dumbed down for their liking. Remaking any game is a significant undertaking. Not in the logistics of it necessarily, those have been figured out before, but in managing to do due diligence to the original while justifying the remake in the first place. These two concepts that can seem to be at odds leave plenty of room for great developers to weave between them and come out with something great. There was quite a bit of time between RE4 and its remake, enough that it was warranted to most people. Still, many were hesitant that it wouldn't quite live up to their grand expectations. Among other updates and new features, the addition of the parry mechanic to Leon's arsenal made the combat feel that much more modern and dynamic. It takes sentiments from recent games and applies them to what made Resident Evil 4 unique back in the day without overwhelming the player. So much so that it's not crazy to feel like this remake might be the definitive version to play in the future. And for a retelling of such a beloved game, that's all you can really strive and hope for.